Chapter 22. Jamie and his group followed the rebels through the dark corridors of the abandoned church. The air was thick with an eerie silence that made their every step feel deafening. The rebels seemed to know their way, their movements guided by a sense of purpose that escaped Jamie and his group. As they turned a corner, the rebels suddenly stopped, their fists clenched tightly. In the distance, they could hear the sound of shuffling footsteps and low, guttural growls. Something was coming, something that filled the rebels with fear. Jamie's heart raced as he drew his weapon, unsure of what was about to confront them. He exchanged a glance with Alana and Lilith, both of whom looked equally apprehensive. The rebels whispered to one another, their voices barely above a whisper. "It's the shadows. They found us." Jamie's stomach lurched at the words, the shadows. The same force that had been haunting them ever since they set foot in the mansion. Suddenly, the shadows emerged from the darkness, their black tendrils snaking towards them. The rebels fought back with everything they had, but the shadows were relentless, their power seemingly infinite. Jamie and his group joined the fight, their weapons slashing through the darkness. The battle was fierce, but they managed to hold their own. After what seemed like hours, the shadows retreated, vanishing back into the darkness from which they came. Jamie and his group were left standing in the eerie silence, their weapons still drawn, unsure of what to do next. The rebels turned to them, their faces etched with a mix of fear and determination. "We need to keep moving," one of them said. "We can't stay here for long. The shadows will be back soon." Jamie and his group nodded in agreement, their resolve hardened by the battle they had just fought. They were on the right path, slowly uncovering the mysteries of the power of darkness that had been haunting them. As they resumed their journey, Jamie couldn't help but wonder what other horrors awaited them in the darkness of the abandoned church. Chapter 23. As they followed the rebels down the winding staircase of the church, a sense of unease washed over Jamie. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though they were deep underground. Suddenly, a deafening scream echoed through the cavernous halls, causing everyone to freeze in their tracks. Ilana's grip on Jamie's arm tightened, and Lilith clutched Sophia's hand. "What was that?" Lilith whispered, her eyes darting around the dimly lit space. The rebels exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. They continued to lead the group deeper into the bowels of the church until they reached a large metal door. One of the rebels pulled out a set of keys and unlocked it, revealing a dark room. "Be very careful," the rebel warned as they stepped inside. The room was filled with shelves of ancient books and artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The rebels began to search through the shelves, their eyes scanning for something specific. Jamie could feel his heart racing as he scanned the room. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of dark magic was hidden within these walls, and what kind of power it held over them. Suddenly, a strange sensation washed over him. It was as if something was whispering in his ear, urging him to take one of the ancient tomes from the shelf. "Jamie!" Ilana's voice broke through his thoughts. "You okay?" Jamie nodded, trying to shake off the feeling. But as he turned back to the shelves, his eyes locked on to a particularly foreboding book. The title read simply, "The Power of Darkness." The urge to take the book was almost overwhelming. Jamie reached out and grabbed it off the shelf, but as soon as his fingers touched the cover, he was overwhelmed with a sense of dread. "Jamie, put it back," Ilana pleaded, sensing his hesitation. But Jamie was drawn to the book like a moth to flame. He opened it, and as he read the first few sentences, he felt a shiver run down his spine. "Jamie, stop!" Lilith's voice was filled with urgency now, but it was too late. The room suddenly filled with a blinding light, and Jamie felt himself being pulled into a vortex of darkness. He could hear Ilana and Lilith calling his name, but their voices were muffled, distant. And then, as quickly as it had started, the darkness dissipated. Jamie found himself standing in a different room, one that was unfamiliar to him. He looked around, disoriented, and realized with a sickening feeling that he was no longer in the abandoned church. Chapter 24. Jamie's eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness in the room. The only source of light came from the book he had touched moments ago. He could feel the heavy weight of the power of darkness pressing down on him, suffocating him. Jamie's breath came out in short gasps as he tried to calm himself down. He looked around and saw that he was not alone. The room was filled with shadowy figures that twisted and writhed around him. They looked like the shadows he had seen in the church, but more menacing and sinister. Jamie felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that these shadows were alive. They had been waiting for him. He tried to step back, but found that his feet were rooted to the ground. The shadows moved closer, wrapping themselves around him. Jamie's heart raced as he realized that it was too late to escape. The power of darkness had taken control of him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows began to engulf him, filling him up with their malevolent energy. Jamie felt like he was being torn apart, but also reborn at the same time. The power of darkness was consuming him, and he couldn't resist its pull. Suddenly, a bright light appeared and the shadows retreated. Jamie stumbled back, gasping for air. He looked up and saw that Ilana and Lilith had joined him in the room. They had followed him and had managed to break the spell of the power of darkness. Jamie felt tears of relief stream down his face. He had been so close to becoming part of the darkness forever. Ilana and Lilith helped him up as they looked around the room. It was filled with ancient artifacts, each one pulsing with its own dark energy. Jamie knew they had to leave the room, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They made their way out of the room, and as they left, the shadows whispered in their ears, promising them that they would return. Jamie knew that they had to find a way to stop the power of darkness. The shadows were just the beginning, and he knew that things were going to get much worse from here on out. Chapter 25. Jamie, Ilana, Lilith, and Sophia followed the rebels out of the dark room and into a brighter corridor. As they walked, the oppressive weight of the malevolent force lifted, and they felt like they could breathe again. The rebels explained that they had found a way to weaken the power of darkness, and that they needed the group's help. The rebels led them into a hidden chamber where they revealed an ancient artifact that contained the power to banish the darkness. However, the artifact was incomplete, and they needed the missing pieces to activate it. Jamie and his group agreed to help, and they set off on a quest to find the missing pieces. Along the way, they encountered friendly spirits and helpful creatures, and they felt the power of light growing stronger with each step. As they gathered the missing pieces, they also learned more about the origins of the power of darkness. They discovered that it had been created by a group of ancient sorcerers who sought to gain ultimate power, but had only succeeded in unleashing a destructive force that threatened to consume the world. With the missing pieces in hand, Jamie and his group returned to the rebels' base, where they worked together to activate the artifact. As the light of the artifact spread, the darkness retreated, and the rebels cheered in triumph. Jamie and his group felt a sense of relief and triumph as they watched the power of darkness diminish. However, they knew that their journey was far from over, and that they would have to fight to maintain the light and keep the darkness at bay. Together, they set off into the future, knowing that they had the power to challenge even the greatest of evils. Chapter 26. As the darkness retreated, Jamie and his group breathed a sigh of relief. They had successfully banished the malevolent power that had consumed the mansion, and now they could focus on getting out of there and returning to their normal lives. But just as they were about to leave the room, a blood-curdling scream filled the air. It was coming from one of the rebels who had been standing too close to the activated artifact. His body was convulsing. His eyes rolled back in his head. Jamie and his group rushed to help, but it was too late. The rebel's body exploded in a shower of blood and gore, leaving nothing behind but a few scraps of clothing. The group was stunned. They had no idea that activating the artifact would have such devastating consequences. They were horrified at the loss of life, and they knew they had to find a way to make things right. But as they turned to leave, they heard a voice whispering in their ear. It was a sinister voice filled with malice and hate. "You may have banished me for now," the voice said, "but I will return. And when I do, I will be stronger than ever before." Jamie and his group knew that the power of darkness was still out there, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike, and they knew they would have to be ready when it did. Chapter 27. Jamie and his group stumbled out of the mansion, gasping for fresh air. The sky was tinged with pink and orange as dawn approached, and the birds began to chirp. It was as though the world outside the mansion had been waiting for them to return. Ilana and Lilith hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Jamie watched them, feeling a sense of gratitude towards them for saving him from the darkness. "We did it," Lilith said, her voice shaken. "We've banished the darkness." "But at what cost?" Ilana said, her eyes still glistening. "One of our own is gone." Jamie felt a pang of guilt. He knew that they were all in danger because of him. If he had never opened that book, they wouldn't have to go through all of this. But he pushed the thought aside and looked at the rebels who were standing a few feet away from them. They were all smiling, relieved that the nightmare was over. "Thank you," Jamie said, his voice hoarse. "We couldn't have done it without you." The rebels nodded, and one of them stepped forward. "We need to get rid of the artifact," he said. "It's too dangerous to keep it." Jamie agreed, and they all made their way to the nearby river, where they tossed the artifact as far as they could. It disappeared beneath the water, and they all breathed a sigh of relief as they walked back towards the mansion. Jamie felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that the darkness was still out there, but for now, they had won. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that they could stop the darkness from returning. Hopeful that they could live their lives without fear. The sun was fully up now, casting a warm glow over everything. Jamie smiled, feeling the sun rays on his face. It was a new day, and he was ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 28. Days turned into weeks, and Jamie's life began to normalize. He resumed his old routine, going to work, meeting friends, and visiting his family. But the eerie feeling he had felt inside the mansion never left. There was a constant unease within him, a foreboding sense that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night after returning from a work trip, Jamie walked into his house and noticed that something was off. The lights were on, which was unusual for this hour of the night. He called out to his wife, but there was no reply. He walked towards the living room, and that's when he saw her. Ilana was sitting in the armchair, her eyes fixed on the wall. She didn't respond when he called out to her. He walked closer to her, and that's when he saw it. A dark, shadowy figure standing behind her, towering over her like a predator. Jamie felt his heart hammering inside his chest as he realized what was happening. He backed away slowly, but the figure turned towards him, filling the room with its malevolent aura. Jamie felt paralyzed, unable to move a muscle. The figure began to speak, its voice resonating deep within him. "I warned you, Jamie. I warned you that the darkness would return, and now it's consuming your beloved wife. You could have prevented this, but you chose to banish me instead. You should have known that I cannot be contained for long. Now you will pay the price." Jamie felt a surge of anger and fear intermingled within him. He couldn't let this thing take away his wife. He had to fight back. He closed his eyes and focused his mind, trying to find a way to defeat the power of darkness. When he opened his eyes, he saw something standing beside him. A small creature with a fiery red mane and sharp claws. It looked up at him and nodded as if acknowledging his thoughts. Without hesitation, Jamie lunged towards the shadowy figure, ready to fight. The creature beside him followed suit, leaping at the figure with its claws bared. As they fought, Jamie felt his fury growing, his mind focusing on nothing but the desire to banish the darkness. He could hear his wife's voice calling out to him, urging him to keep going. The fight was intense, but finally the shadowy figure screeched and vanished into thin air. Jamie fell to his knees, panting and sweating, but relieved that he had saved his wife. Ilana woke up with a start, and the two of them embraced each other tightly, relieved that the nightmare was over. But as they stood up, they saw something in the corner of the room, a small black box with a note attached to it. Jamie approached the box and picked it up. The note read, "The darkness will never leave you, Jamie. Be prepared for what's to come." Jamie felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the battle was far from over. He knew that the darkness would return and that he would have to fight again. But for now, he was just grateful to have saved his wife and to have the strength to keep fighting. Chapter 29. Despite the success of banishing the darkness, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He tried to ignore it, but one night he woke up in a cold sweat. He sat up in bed and looked around the room. Everything appeared normal, but the air felt thick and heavy. Jamie got out of bed and walked over to the window. He peered outside and saw the sky was dark and stormy. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the mansion and the surrounding trees. Suddenly, Jamie heard a faint whispering. He turned around, but no one was there. The whispering grew louder, and Jamie realized it was coming from the direction of his wife's dressing room. He cautiously made his way over to the door and opened it. The room was empty, but the whispering continued. Jamie followed the sound to the closet, where he found a book lying on the floor. He picked it up and examined the cover. It was old and worn, with strange symbols etched into the leather. Jamie opened the book and began to read. As he did, he felt a powerful force pushing him deeper and deeper into the darkness. He screamed, but no one heard him. The darkness consumed him, and Jamie was lost. When he came to, he was no longer in the mansion. He was in a strange place, surrounded by darkness. He heard the same sinister voice he had heard before, warning him that the power of darkness had returned stronger than ever. Jamie knew he had to fight, but he didn't know how. The darkness was more powerful than he could have imagined, and he was alone. But just as he was about to give up hope, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. It was Lilith. She had somehow made her way into the darkness, and she was there to help him. With Lilith by his side, Jamie fought against the darkness. It was a long and grueling battle, but they emerged victorious. The darkness retreated once again, and Jamie and Lilith were able to make their way back to the mansion. Jamie knew that the darkness would continue to come back, but he was ready to face it head on. He had learned that he was not alone, and he had the strength to overcome even the most powerful of forces. As he lay in bed that night with his wife by his side, Jamie knew that the darkness would never truly be gone, but he also knew that he was no longer afraid. Chapter 30. Jamie woke up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat. He had dreamt of the mansion, but it was different this time. He saw himself sitting in a chair, surrounded by darkness. The book lay open in his lap, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, but they weren't just any footsteps. They were heavy, almost thudding, and they seemed to come from the walls themselves. Jamie tried to get up and leave the room, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, and the footsteps grew louder and closer. He saw a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness, and he knew that he was not alone. Panic set in, and Jamie began to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The eyes moved closer, and he could see that they belonged to a figure covered in shadows. The figure extended its hand and touched Jamie's forehead, and he felt the searing pain shoot through his body. The last thing he saw was the book's pages fluttering, and then everything went black. When Jamie woke up the next morning, he had a splitting headache. He couldn't remember anything after the figure touched him, but he knew that something had changed. He got up out of bed and walked to the living room, only to see the book was open on the coffee table. Part of him wanted to run away, but another part wanted to read it again. He sat down and started to read, and as he did, he felt the darkness seeping into him once more. This time, though, he was in control. He felt empowered, stronger than he had ever been before. He knew that the darkness was part of him now, and he welcomed it. Jamie knew that he couldn't tell the others. They would be afraid of him, and they might even try to stop him. He had to keep this to himself and use the power when he needed it. He had tasted the darkness, and he knew that he could never go back